microphone work?
Slippery back here.
Also, what I should have brought, I think, is
A pornographic movie.
Just to start things off right.
However, I didn't know how they feel about it at Ames, Iowa, and I'll just have to go on the assumption that you've all seen one at one time or another anyway. In lieu of a dirty movie, maybe you'll let me clean up slightly a dirty joke, which seems to lead into the topic of the evening rather neatly. It's a story about a young man who goes to a psychiatrist for treatment, and the psychiatrist offers him a Rorschach test. And as he goes through the cards, one card after another presents the same thing to him. He sees in one card that there's a fellow making out with a girl, and in another there's a fellow that seems to be making out with a fellow, and so on, right through the cards, until finally the doctor can't stand it anymore. He says, "Pardon me, but I know it's very unprofessional of me, but I must tell you, in the 12 years that I've been practicing psychiatry, you are, without question, you have the dirtiest, most obscene mind of anyone that I've ever come across." And the young patient looked at the doctor and said, "What do you mean? I'm dirty. They're your pictures." The idea being, of course, that obscenity lies in the eye of the beholder. And I'm afraid that since movies began in 1895, people have been beholding them as something slightly obscene, if not worse. I suspect that it has to do, at least in part, with the way in which, until fairly recently, we were seeing movies. It's usually in a darkened theater with all sorts of suggestions of promiscuity in the darkness. It also has a kind of peep show atmosphere to it. We come to a theater and act essentially as voyeurs. We're peeping in on somebody else's lives, and those lives are projected, and this is another thing that worried, since the very beginning, worried people who wanted to censor the movies. They are seen larger than life. There's a rather famous letter that's reproduced in Terry Ramsey's Million and One Nights, an early history of the movies, in which it was a film made in 1893, really 50 seconds long, and it showed two people, not terribly attractive middle-aged people, kissing. That's really all it was. It's known as the May Irwin John C. Rice kiss. And she's rather portly, and he has a rather flowy mustache. And in the course of this illuminating 50 seconds of action, all he does is smooth back his mustaches and plant a kiss on the smiling May Irwin. Actually, this bit of staggering action occurred in a play, The Widow Jones, that had run apparently unmolested for several years. But then this film appeared, and people said, how shocking. One reverend compared it to cattle in a stockyard, and felt, of course, immediately that films ought to be suppressed. There's a very interesting and amusing little sample of film at the Museum of Modern Art showing the dance, the danse du ventre, the belly dance, of a lady named Fatima, again a rather corpulent type. She had danced her dance at one of the expositions on the Midway, I think, in St. Louis in 1896. And I must assure you, she's fully clothed, but she is rather heavily bejeweled, or at least bebangled. And for the 50 or 60 seconds in which Fatima does her danse du ventre, those bangles get quite a workout. And well, this apparently disturbed a good many people, because there exists in the museum's collection both Fatima
came from our
uncensored,
energetic forebears
and the
working in
censored version
forestry.
of Fatima. Now, in
Now,
those
these early
days,
leaders,
since
by
the films
today's
were only
standards,
50 or 60
would have been
seconds
called
long
militant,
anyway, there's
with
very little
tremendous
that you could cut
consciousness
out.
of their mission.
But they worked out a rather
The
ingenious
organization
system.
I'm
They
working
put
with,
up two
Forest Laboratory,
two bands.
part
They
of
look
the
like
US
two
Forest
picket
Service,
fences
and our
running
major
horizontally
forestry schools,
across the
such as
frame
that here at Iowa
and
State
across
University,
what were
came
considered
into
the
existence
more
as a result
censorable
of
parts
direct
of
involvement
Fatima's
of these great
anatomy.
pioneers in resource
Uh,
management.
The first real
such inheritance
censorship
counts for
actions, that is to say,
then all of us
police
here should be
actions,
deeply concerned
began as
with
early
what
as
seems to be a
1907
conservation
in
renaissance.
Chicago, which still
Our predecessors
has
were
a
remarkably successful
municipal
men who achieved
censor
much of
team
what
in
they set out to
operation,
do.
in residence.
But now we're
In
in
New
a
York,
world,
as early as
a world which would be
1909.
scarcely recognizable,
Usually,
of even a few
the
decades
reason given, at
And the
least
old
in those
concept of
early days,
conservation
was to
was
protect the
acquiring
working
completely
man.
new
This was the
dimensions.
time of the Nickelodeons, and there were
World
many
War
people who
II
were not
interrupted
sure
public concern
whether
for
a nickel
conservation.
movie
during
was
these war years
to
that
be
we spent
preferred
resources and
to a
produced
nickel
fashion.
glass of
Their
beer.
critical importance
As a matter of fact, I'm sure that
permanently colored our
the
thinking.
reformers were out to get both of
During the
them,
Korean War
but they did
period, that President Truman, in a
focus in
landmark move,
on the
appointed
moving
the President's
pictures
Material
in that
Policy
early
Commission
era,
under the chairmanship of William
because,
Pauley, to make a
well,
survey of the
they were
national
not sure
requirements,
that this is
the
what
supplies of materials, the energy sources, and water.
what people should be seeing.
summary, the
You know,
report
it's always
found fears for
a
the
part of the
immediate
censor mind
did
that
find
they're
cause for concern.
eager to protect someone else.
about that
In
same
those
time,
days, they
the
were eager to
modern-day
protect
prophet
the working
appeared
man.
with a disturbing
These
message
days, it seems to be
intended to
the
affect
children
popular
who are
thinking.
being invoked.
William
But in
Boyd,
any case, you can be
Rachel
sure
Carter,
that the people
John
who are
Kenneth
doing the
Galbraith,
censoring
and others
don't feel that their
questioned
own
some of
morals
our
are going to be
habits and
impaired
behaviors.
in any way in the
At
process.
first, only more thoughtful members of the
The
community were affected.
idea of
Gradually,
the
however, there developed a growing
what is
concern
was
for
since
our
to become
exploding national
was
and world
later to
population.
become the National Board of Review
We have
actually
become
grew out
painfully
of
aware
the
of a
incident in New
population
York
problem.
in
A problem
1909.
with no easy nor rapid
Theaters,
answer.
all theaters were closed
You
for
realize
several
that even
weeks
if we in the
until
United
a
States
board of
instantly
concerned
dropped our birth rate
citizens
to the mere
was
replacement
established,
level,
and these
still
people
told
agreed to look
100
at
million
all
people.
films, and then a picture
far
that was
larger
passed
percentage
by their
increase
board
in world
could be
population
shown
is inevitable.
anywhere.
This increase in
So you
demand
have,
has
as
posed
early
an
as that,
enormous
both the
resource problem in
establishment
very
of,
few decades.
municipal
Commensurate with
and
this
official
exploding
censor
population
groups
in large
and the
concentrated
semi-official
city areas was an
appointed
awareness of our environment.
citizens' body.
Smog,
In 1915, the federal government came into the act. In a rather famous case called Mutual versus
physical
Ohio,
discomfort,
the,
and a few deaths made us aware of air pollution.
a suit was
Tourists,
brought to
vacationers,
the Supreme
and
Court
recreationists in unprecedented
testing
numbers
the validity of the
acquired
banning of a
personal
certain
awareness of the
film.
environment.
And
some subtle
the
fact
upshot of this
that many
case
streams and lakes
was
were
in
unfit for human use.
1915
More
the
recently,
denial
we heard of the
of motion
contamination of
pictures, the
estuaries,
right of
ocean
protection
beaches,
under
and the
the
oceans
First
themselves.
Amendment. From
Accidents like oil
1915
spills
until
and ecological
1952,
surprises like those
movies
resulting
were,
from DDT,
in the words of this
lead, and
decision,
mercury
an
added to the
instrument
alarm.
of commerce. The motion picture was, it was denied that the motion picture
Not that
could
we're all red and white, even in the U.S. Forest Service,
be a work
even
of
in the
art.
ministry.
It was denied that it was
I guess in my
that
benefit.
it was
Even we
instrument
contribute to this
of
in our present
conveying
operation. I
ideas.
think there's another one
It
there
was
too.
simply an instrument of commerce.
In the United
Because the
States,
motion picture
our
both
appetite
reflects
for
and
feature commerce
affects
drives our
its
demand
society,
for energies
it
and
becomes
minerals to
particularly
levels that
vulnerable
support
to
increasing
attack
dependence
at
on
those
other
times
nations.
when society itself has undergone
5%
shifts
of the
and
world
upheavals
population,
in its
we
moral
use some
values.
40% of its
We saw the first great
I think that's
evidence of
important
that,
to
at
repeat.
least as related to motion
5%
pictures,
of the world
immediately
population
after
we are using
World
for
War
40%
I.
of its
Up until that time, the
Currently in
films,
United States, we are temporarily
believe me, were
an energy
pretty
crisis.
moral. Things that were
Energy is the
concerning
lifeblood of our system,
concerning
and
the
the production of
censors at that
energy is a
time was
major source
that
of pollution.
films like
Now, as world
The Drunkard's
population and
Reformation
living standards rise,
and
we will find increasing competition
a
for
film like
everything we
The
enjoy.
Kleptomaniac, in which
Our
it
suppliers
was made quite clear
want to sell us
that
not
the
crude
law
oil,
protected
but
a
gasoline,
rich society
not
woman
ore,
who
but
happened
steel.
to be
Not
caught
steel, but
shoplifting in an
automobile.
department store,
And they will
while
want
a
to
poor
protect
woman
their
who
own
had been
future
stealing
needs.
bread for her family was sent to
Concerns of the day
jail.
are forcing us to be
Pictures
much
of
more
that
aware of the
kind
interaction,
really were
adequacy of the resources,
part and parcel
energy demand,
of the
food
Nickelodeon
supply,
era.
water supply,
And
air and water
it wasn't
pollution.
until around
All of these
1915
together affect
that
what
the
we
movies
refer
began
to as
to
the environment.
grow, that the
And
movies
they have
began
much
to
to do
attract
with the
a
quality of
middle-class audience. And
If
that
we look
middle-class
just a short way
audience
into the future,
seemed to
we are
prefer
driven to the
more
view that we must
sophisticated
also be
fare,
aware of the needs
somewhat
and
more
aspirations of
sophisticated
other
fare.
peoples of the world.
After World
We
War
are
I, as I
not
said,
self-sufficient.
there's a
Charitable
rather
feelings aside,
famous
we will
experiment
have
that was
an
done
insecure
by
existence
Cecil B.
if we
DeMille.
ignore the needs of others
DeMille
and our
recognized,
impact on the rest of
with
the
his
world.
great
This
flair
report
for
puts us in the
showmanship,
classic dilemma.
that the films that had been
At the
turned
present
out
time, the damage we do
during
to
World
the
War I,
environment in
pictures
taking
in
care of
which
our needs is certainly serious.
Mary Pickford
Catastrophic.
or Lillian Gish
Is it any wonder
was
why
always
there
on the verge
has
of
been an
being
almost
attacked by
unbelievable rise in the
one
number
or
and
another
strength of
representative
amateur
of the
environmental
German
activists?
Imperial Army.
Some of these amateurs
He
provide much of
realized
the
that this
driving
kind of
force
film,
behind
these
what is
war
happening.
movies in general, were not going to be too popular once hostilities were ended. And so in a very brief period,
I feel is an
in
undeserved distinction.
less than a year,
Other industry
he
groups
turned out
caused
4
equal or greater
different kinds of
environmental damage
films.
than that have yet
One was a
been
Western,
proportionate to
one was a
receive
melodrama, one
Now, a
was
cynic
a
at this point
picture
might say
called
that we are
Don't
seeing
Change Your
one more in a
Husband.
succession of cases
The
where the
film
media
that
and the
was
public
overwhelmingly
inflate
successful
problems
was
behind
Don't
life
Change
facts.
Your Husband.
When we
And
discover the cost of
in
correcting the
the
problems,
next few
we
years,
abandon them
you had from
for
Cecil
newer and more
B.
interesting
DeMille
worries.
a number of
what is happening
sociological
in
inquiries with titles like
As a manager
Why
of the
Marry Your
Forest
Wife,
Resource, and I'm speaking
Male
about
and
those within the
Female,
Forest Service,
Adam's Rib,
we wish
and
to
so
make
on.
sound decisions.
All of them pictures
But in the
that had
present
a
flood of
high
diverse and
society
divergent
background
opinions,
and
what
had to
are we
do
to
with
do?
the
It is a long time from seedling to mature tree.
well, the way he
What will be
thought
the place and the
high
need for
society
timber in the
behaved.
world of commerce
Very
when
luxuriously
the present
dressed.
crop
This
matures?
is the period in
Or the
which
crop after
Cecil
that?
B. DeMille introduced the
professional
bathtub
responsibility
and the
and
boudoir
our native instincts
and
force us to be very aware of the environment.
extended studies
Forests are
of
not only
how
sources of
ladies
great
dress
aesthetic
and
pleasure,
undress
but have
with glamorous
all other uses and
stars
values.
such as
Such as
Gloria
that
Swanson
practiced under
on
the
hand to do
multiple-use
the
concept
demonstration.
On some 187
The pictures were very
acres
popular
managed by the U.S.
and
Forest.
actually
old
did
habits,
set a
most
trend
they are still
for
there.
American
Water,
films during
forest,
that period.
wildlife, recreation,
But here
and
is where
more.
the split began
It is
to
obvious,
first
however, that
appear.
life in the future will
It
depend
was right after
overwhelmingly
World
on our
War
ability to
I,
make the least
and
damaging
many
compromise.
of the
Under wise
many of the
management,
people were
harvesting
more
crops of
worldly
timber causes
wise
only
than
transient disturbances.
before the war had
But a decision
begun.
to reduce
How you going to keep them down on the
emphasis
farm
on
was
efficient
more
crop
than
production
simply a
and
popular
utilization,
song.
and to
It
satisfy
indicated
more
that there
material
was a
needs
new
with
kind of
irreplaceable
awakening to the
minerals
world, a
would,
new
I
kind of
believe,
awareness
result in
of the
greater
world.
net
And it was
gain.
that kind of awareness that was
the
being
problems posed
reflected
by all of this
in the
are
DeMille
incredibly
pictures
complex.
and those of his imitators.
Decisions must be
But at
made.
the same time,
unless
and this
we
is the
improve our
interesting thing, at the
understanding,
same
we'll be
time,
managing from a
there were
position of
other
ignorance.
sections of this
So we
country
must
that were
initiate the
seeing
task of
pictures and
developing
making
foundational
immensely
facts
wealthy
and
at
opinions,
that time.
and begin the
D.W. Griffith,
formulation of some options and
probably his
alternatives
greatest success
if cutting
was a
practices
film
of the
called
timber
Way Down
resources are to
East,
be halted.
which was based on a play that
We
was
read
firmly
the
rooted
technology
in the
of
Victorian
forestry
values,
and
which
the
he
wood
himself prized so highly.
Wood is one of the most economic,
So that on the one hand,
affordable,
you have a
essential,
population that
all
is
our
growing
resources.
up, particularly in the
simple
eastern
fact, I
cities,
was interested to
and
read
is
the
supporting
results
one
of the
kind of
National
film,
Academy
wants
of
to
Sciences
see
report,
one kind of film,
Resources in Man.
that another part of the
Object
country,
of
another
this
section of the
early this
country,
morning.
feels is
How did timber
quite
create the world
immoral.
it described?
I must say,
A world with
the
short of
people in
nearly
the eastern
everything but
cities
people.
also went to see Way
I
Down
learned that the
East,
report had
but
only a
then
few sentences on
people in the
forests and
eastern
timber,
cities, they'll
and a
see
conclusion
anything.
that forests interfere with food production.
It was this split, however, that made great sections of this country begin to speak of Hollywood as the Gomorrah of the West. And the newspapers began to print stories not only criticizing the movies themselves, but more especially criticizing the lifestyle of the people who make the movies. And I must say that the people who make the movies gave considerable fodder to those journalists.
There is great
in a very brief
interchangeability
period in
materials for many
1922,
applications.
you had
Beams or
the
panels can be made
startling
of steel,
revelation
aluminum,
that
or
Wallace
fiberglass.
Reed, who was one of the
The strategy
first,
of choosing among alternatives
matinee
requires
idols
some
of
sense
the
a
American
whole resource
screen,
picture
had
of our
been
competitive position
a
in
dope
drawing on
addict.
foreign resources,
And
how
the
wood
story
can
was
serve to
that
alleviate
he had been
the
put
short
on dope
supply and
by the
environmental
studios
problem.
in order to keep him working.
A recent publication
And his
by
his
Raymond
wife
Newell, and
has
Drive Next
stoutly
Slide, please,
maintained, still does,
summarizes
that
the
the
resource
thing
picture
that
for two giants
killed
in the
him
world,
was
the
not
United
dope,
States and the
but his
USSR.
valiant attempts to get off the habit.
His listing of the major raw
There was
materials
also
in which we are and
the,
are not self-sufficient is
many
startling.
things.
And a quick glance
Mary
at that
Pickford, Little Mary,
gets us to that
who was
point.
adored
Some
by
of us conclude
everyone
we should use wood
during that period,
efficiently and to the limit
around
of its capacity
1920.
before arbitrarily encouraging development of substitutes which will
suddenly,
cause us to lose vital options in the future. Can I have the next slide, please? Howard?
married Douglas Fairbanks, even though Douglas Fairbanks had to dispose of a previous wife in order to make it happen. And there was the case of, probably most notorious of all, the
Will
case
inevitably
of
require us to
Fatty
import more
Arbuckle,
bauxite,
who had been
iron
accused
ore,
of,
petroleum, and so on.
of rape,
These are
and
the kind
then
of choices we are talking about.
cleared
Now, in
cleared
speaking on such a
subsequently in
topic,
3
I think I must
trials,
confess to
but
being
those
an
3
amateur.
trials were
where are
very
the experts?
thoroughly covered by the
We look to
press.
economists for projections into the
The
future.
strange murder of
Our
William
economists
Desmond
are
Taylor,
efficient in judging
still
concerning
unsolved,
materials,
but
energy, and
involving, among
environmental
others,
problems.
Mary Miles
future
Minter, who
as
was probably
ecologists are
second in
deficient in their
popularity
techniques of
only
projection.
to Mary Pickford at that time,
When we look
and
at
Mabel
the National
Normand,
Academy of
who was
Science,
one of
the
the
National Materials Advisory
one of
Board,
the
Congress,
leading
Research
comedians
Foundation,
of the
or
day.
Office of Management
All of these coming to a
evidence
head
of
at one
sound, total
time
resource
and seeming to
planning, we are
confirm the
disappointed
worst
by their
suspicions
ignorance of the
that
timber
people
resource and
had
its potential.
about movies
There
anyway.
is great opportunity
And this
for
led
scholarly
to the
study
formation
by resource
of
economists.
the Motion Picture Production
Now, if you think the array of facts I've
Administration,
presented thus
known
far
at that
sounds
time
serious,
as the Hayes
you are
Office,
quite right.
known subsequently
They
as
are
the
serious.
Johnson Office,
With
known
a
presently
time
as
scale
the
of a couple of
Valenti
generations
Office.
into the
But
future,
no
we
matter
should be
how the
prepared.
heads or the initials change,
Our own
it's
standard
still
of living
the same
might continue to
organization.
rise.
An organization that was
feel
formed
concern
in
for our
1922
children
in
and
one of the
grandchildren.
rarest moves that the
Most
motion
people do
picture
not think
industry
of generation
has
X.
ever taken.
But we
They got
enforce
together
their
on
accustomed to the
something,
idea of
just
planning
once. They don't do it
change.
very
We
often.
will not
But
live
they did see the
without
need to fight
We
off
must also think in terms of planting
the
seeds of
threat
policy
that all of these
that eventually
expose
will be of great
articles
importance
were
to human
leading
welfare.
to, the threat of a
By
national
now you must
censorship.
be what
In
I
order
believe
to
the
effect
public
that,
should expect
they
of cinema
hired
managers and
Will
researchers.
Hayes, a Presbyterian
must
elder,
expand
very
our vision of
respectable,
taking far more
also
ideas
Postmaster
than
General
the
of the
minds
Harding
of the conservationists
administration,
in the past.
not necessarily quite
We
so
must think in
respectable,
terms
but it
of
did
growing
carry a certain
populations
political
with
weight,
rising
and
expectations.
put him in
Increasing
charge
demand
as
for
czar
minerals,
of the
materials,
motion picture
energy,
industry,
and
even as a few
modifying
years earlier,
pollution load
the
imposed on the environment.
baseball
We
leagues
should think
had
beyond
appointed
our own needs
Judge
of what we
Kennesaw
can produce and import.
Mountain Landis
We should think how
as the
others can
czar
benefit from
of
the better
baseball
use of
after their
resources.
unsavory scandals
Every
in
aspect of this picture
1919.
adds to the impressive value of wood to our nation and to the
Hayes
world.
was successful in warding
is a
off
renewable
a
resource.
national
Each
censorship.
crop can be better than the
He
one
was
before.
partially successful
requires
in warding
relatively
off
simple systems
threats of state
and
censorships.
comparatively little
As many
energy
as 32 states
its
had bills
production,
pending
processing,
when the Motion
and use.
Picture Association was
Soil
formed.
pollution problems and properly managed
He
dams,
whittled that down
efficient harvesting,
to
and
something like
utilization will be
13.
minor.
And achieved some rather curious compromises. One of
Well,
the
recently, people in high places have
most
recommended
threatening
more effort
was
going
one
to
in
developing
Massachusetts,
substitutes for wood.
where
We
they were
argue
going
that
to
this
have
is
a
poor
firm
alternative to
censorship law
increasing the
throughout the
efficiency
state.
of growing and utilizing timber.
After a great deal of
Strictly in
maneuvering,
view of rising
Hayes was
national
able to
and
get them to
international
change their
demand for
mind
all
and
resources.
only censor pictures on
Some even
Sunday.
have some suggestions that come from the Office of Management and Budget.
Part of his function, part of the function of his staff, was to go around the country talking to various women's clubs and that kind of organization to pacify them, to assure them that the motion picture studios were responsible, headed by responsible men, and that they were going to try to clean their own house. One of the ways of cleaning their own house was to write into studio contracts a morals clause. It was also a time in which they, curiously enough, were also very much concerned about dope, and they made up their own blacklist of actors and actresses who were known to be on the hard stuff and gradually eliminated them from the studios. But more than that, the work of the production, of the Motion Picture Production Administration was to draw up a code, and it has a direct bearing to the present code that we know and speak of so often. It was literally a code. It was a codification of existing municipal and state laws as far as it was humanly possible. Censors are a strange breed. I saw on the news yesterday the lady censor from Maryland, who was talking about the garbage. She kept calling it the garbage that she had to look at all the time. And the interviewer asked her, I thought rather mildly and politely, how she knew it was garbage. And she said, I know garbage when I see garbage. Well, censors have very peculiar ideas sometimes of what is garbage and what is not. There was a rather famous censor who wouldn't allow any picture on the screens of his state in which you saw a maid breaking dishes. Apparently he had a maid at home who broke dishes, and he felt that this was encouraging that kind of activity. Really, as you look through some of the instances, censors are also rather secretive at times, but every once in a while, records of their proceedings do come to light. This was slightly later, but Pennsylvania was one of the states that had a very strong censor body, headed by a Dr. Oberhauser, and
it is rather that it will be to the advantage of the nation.
Well, one of the last pictures that I saw in Philadelphia before moving to New York, where censorship was lighter, was a film called Letty Linton with Clark Gable and Joan Crawford. And I remember at one point in the film, he turns on Joan Crawford and he says, "Why, you're nothing but a..." The soundtrack went dead. As a matter of fact, it went, because they had blooped out the word. And a few weeks later, I was in New York, happened to see the picture all over again, and discovered to my astonishment that what Clark Gable said to Joan Crawford was, "Why, you're nothing but a tramp." And I'm quite sure that very few people in Philadelphia thought that he said tramp. Even in my tender years, I didn't think he said tramp. And Philadelphia had another easy out. We were just across the river from New Jersey. New Jersey didn't have any censorship at all. And so if a picture came along that was considered too strong for Pennsylvania audiences, like a film called The Road to Ruin, which The Road to Ruin, it turned out, was a strip poker game, which got them all the way down to their bras. But the people of Philadelphia would simply go across the river to Camden and see him there, which, incidentally, is a process that still goes on in places like Memphis, where they have handy, uncensored pictures right across the river. The cue, I think, to what the Hays office was trying to do, quite apart from letting their producers, their members, know what would pass here and what would not pass there, what you could print on the subtitles in one state and what you could not in another. Reminds me of another interesting case in Pennsylvania. There was a film
in material
called
production
Wild
can be
Orchids
described
with,
in terms of a series of systems.
with Greta Garbo.
Let's analyze
And
the systems and the consequences.
In the course of the
expand
story, she slipped away on a rich man's
into
yacht.
The sequence of steps in the production of aluminum are
In Pennsylvania,
mining,
however,
importation of ore,
there was a
separation of alumina,
printed
electrolytic
caption,
reduction to
it was
the
a
metal,
silent film, which
processing to the
informed
product,
us that she had been duly married
and disposal.
before slipping away on the yacht. And it meant that the rest of the picture made no sense whatsoever.
aluminum production, we have two choices.
One of the
Ore bauxite,
things that always happens when you start making up a code of this kind, when you say that you can do this here and that you can't do that there and that you can do this somewhere else, is that the filmmakers naturally say to themselves, well, let's see how far we can go. Let's see how close to the mark we can come. Or maybe we can even get away with a little bit more if we play it carefully. There's always that temptation. There was something that seems to me even more dishonest about this particular approach. Mr. Hayes and his cohorts dreamed up something which they referred to as the law of compensating values. And that sounds very fine and moral. It's the idea that everyone who does evil is suitably punished, and everyone who does good is suitably rewarded, which usually meant that the villain of the piece ended up on the railroad tracks or was sent to jail. The villainous
we have exhausted our excellent iron ore.
it seems to me the villainesses of the 20s, vamps most of them, met watery deaths. In Flesh and the Devil, poor Greta Garbo fell in the ice, the melting ice, and disappeared with astonishing rapidity. In others, they tumbled off the sides of ocean liners or were pushed off cliffs into the water. They really didn't survive. Although they seemed to be having a lot more fun than the heroine while the going was good. The thing that appealed to the producers about this law of compensating values was that it gave them a clear light, a clear green light. They saw to it, they saw very quickly that they could have, let's say, 7 or 8 reels of very profitable sinning, just so long as the right people were killed off in the last 10 minutes or so. And one of the best examples of this, curiously enough, comes from the same Cecil B. DeMille. The first 10 Commandments had as one of its several climaxes the scene in which Moses has gone up into Mount Sinai to receive the law. And while he's up there, you have the damnedest orgy going on around that golden calf below. Then, I was going to say DeMille, but it was really Moses, who came down from the mountain, saw what was going on in lots of good close-ups, smashed the tablets and withdrew. Well, it's a matter of having your cake and eating it too, and that is exactly what the moving picture makers did during the 20s. It should be recognized then that there are at least 3 and maybe 4 forms of censorship. The self-censorship, such as this, represented by the industry through its code. The various state and municipal censor groups, the churches, and more recently, local vigilante groups and ambitious district attorneys, people like Charles Keating, who seems to be everywhere these days. In the early 30s, it became the church's turn to censor. Once again, the moral upheaval
And I suspect the
was
material
there.
suffers a lack of
The
appreciation
country had slipped into the
as to
Depression,
its importance to the nation.
and suddenly
You know, for
the
example,
old
that the weight of
values,
wood harvested per year is
the
similar
law
to
of
steel,
compensating values
Portland cement,
could be
plastics,
and was
aluminum, and copper
called into
combined.
question. It didn't
These people
seem,
would guess
as
this
we
to be
looked
true.
around in those Depression
Weight
years,
alone, of
that
course,
virtue
is
was
not an
being
index of
suitably
value,
rewarded.
but for many structural
And it
and
also
general
didn't
applications,
appear that
a pound of wood is as
crime
much
didn't
useful as a
pay.
pound of steel.
This was
And
the
there
era
is
of
much
the
interchangeability.
gangsters, of the public
take so much
enemies,
of wood use for
of the Al
granted.
Capones, and they
Each
seem to
year,
be
the average
making
citizen
out
uses
all right.
530 pounds of
We
paper
also have to
and
recognize that at this
284
same
feet
time,
of lumber.
the movies themselves
We
changed.
demand wood
This was the period
for
when
the houses
sound
we
was
live in,
introduced,
to the newspaper
and
attendants,
sound
books
made a
we read.
tremendous difference.
From the floors we walk
Sound
on to the
added a
furniture
new
we
kind
relax
of
in.
reality to
From a
films
simple
that didn't
toothpick
exist
to more than
before.
5,000 end
It
products
was no
that
longer
on the floor.
possible for people to talk
All
in the
this
flowery
arises from an industry
subtitles
that is
of the
without
silent
doubt
era.
a low
Now,
technology industry.
language itself
That's
became
next slide.
more earthy, with phrases like,
In
I'll
fact,
bump you off,
expenditures for wood
or
research by industry amounted
let's
to
take him for a
$14 million
ride,
in
entering into
1968.
the argot of
This
the
to
whole
put in-
country
put
by
into
means of the
perspective,
motion
is
picture
less than a third as much as our
medium.
nation spends on false eyelash.
And so,
If in a
naturally enough,
technological world, wood retains
once
the
the
position it does with so
Depression
primitive
had
an
settled
attitude
in,
towards
and
research,
once the
think of what can be
people who
achieved
made
in the
films
way
had
of
learned how
improvement
to
in
work
yield
with
and
this new
property,
medium,
when it
we
was
began to
consumed.
get pictures that dealt
Finally
with this
realized.
scene. We had pictures that
Obviously,
were expose
this outline of
films,
systems could
exposés
be
of
extended,
chain
but
gangs,
trust me, the
exposés
implications
of political
and
corruption,
hazards when
exposés
greater
of
demands are placed
hunger
on renewable
marches.
resources.
We also had
None.
innumerable gangster films. In 1931, literally, one new gangster
Excuse me, final
film
word.
every week.
This presentation
And
attempts to
these
bring together some facts,
swept away
some
a
carefully
great many
considered
of the
judgments
notions
and opinions.
of
And it does
how
form the basis
movies
for a hypothesis.
should be.
Everything
We
we
began
learn
to
about our resources convinces us
recognize
that the nation and the
that
world
this
face serious
this medium
problems
was
resulting in
dealing,
growing
to some
population
extent at least, with the way
from
things
increased
were.
mineral and
And
energy
again,
demand,
there were people
and
who were
from
made
various forms of
unhappy
pollution.
about this. There were people
all
who thought,
materials come
as there
from
always
loss of
are,
energy
that
and damage to the environment.
film
When
should
viewed in such an ecological
avert
context,
its eyes
the wide use
from
of
such
forest and timber
realities,
takes on even
that
greater
film
importance.
should not use
is
the
versatile,
language of
renewable
the street,
material, which serves
or
many needs,
much less the
while
language of
requiring
the gutter.
relatively little energy
There were people who were
and causing
concerned
relatively
because these
little damage to the
films of
environment.
this period began to
decisions
involve
are now
such
being made with respect to our future
unpleasant
dependence
details as unwed
alternative
mothers
industrial
or
Many of these decisions are
career
being made by
prostitutes. It
default,
seemed
from a position
for a
of
while that
ignorance
all of the
rather than
leading
from a
stars
position of knowledge.
were playing
We
prostitutes
hypothesize that it will be
in
in
one
the
film or
long-term
another.
interest
Greta
of the nation
Garbo
and
and
the
Susan
world
Lennox,
to give
her
more
fall
attention
and
to
rise.
efficient production and utilization
Her rise
of
didn't take
resources.
place until she shacked
can
up with
be
the right
done without
politician.
jeopardizing other
Letty
values
Linton
before.
was another such
And it
lady
can often work
with
to
Joan
their
Crawford.
advantage.
Constance Bennett
is
was
not a
always
conclusion.
getting
This
into
is a
trouble
beginning.
with somebody or other
The forestry
in
profession
films
and
like
others concerned
Bed
with
of
the forest
Roses.
resource must decide whether
And,
this constitutes a reasonable
Oh, and there's
alternative.
that marvelous Blonde
We must
Venus
give
with
substance to the
Marlene
opinions
Dietrich,
and a judgment-
in which
judgments which have
Dietrich
been outlined.
takes to the streets in
These
order
are the
to
options and the alternatives.
raise money
Severe
for her
restrictions
little
are
child
imposed
and
on
for an
growing,
operation
cutting,
for her
and
blind
utilizing the
husband,
timber resource.
Herbert Marshall.
From my selfish standpoint, I trust the forest will
And she
continue
managed,
to
although
be
Herbert
a
Marshall never
source of
forgave her.
Now, in closing, let me say that man
The
must
whole
adapt
thing,
to
it seemed,
the
came to a
physical
climax
environment
with the
and its
appearance of Mae
biological
West
component.
on the screen.
We cannot
Mae made
long
her
operate
appearance
as a force
rather
of
late in
For we are not.
1933, but with enormous
is not only a part
effectiveness.
of his ecosystem,
Certainly, I've never
he's the
forgotten
most
her
powerful
first
influence
appearance,
in it.
in which she sweeps into a
Somewhat
nightclub
ironic that we,
wearing
the most precious resource, are
sables
also the most
and
serious threat.
no, I guess
And
no,
I
it's
close
sables,
by saying, can we expect the
and absolutely
better life than
bejeweled
mankind?
from head to toe, and she holds out her wrap to the cloakroom girl, and the cloakroom girl looks at her and says, "Goodness, what diamonds?" And Mae says, "Goodness had nothing to do with it, dearie." and somehow you knew that she meant it. Her first feature film, her first starring film, She Done Him Wrong, based on her own stage play, Diamond Lil, in which she played the good-hearted madam of a bordello, seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back. There had been, mind you, reformist groups all during these 4 years, from 1930 to 1934. As early as 1930, Martin Quigley, who owned one of the trade magazines, a trade publication, the Motion Picture Herald, joined forces with Father Daniel Lord, a Jesuit priest and teacher, to formulate a more rigorous code, a more specific code. Many public groups were complaining about the gangster films, feeling that these were setting patterns for emulation rather than merely reflecting situations that existed. And if you look back at some of the early gangster films, if you see Public Enemy or Little Caesar or Scarface, you'll find somewhere in the course of the action there is a set scene in which a group of concerned citizens sits down with the district attorney and says, "You've got to put the heat on these gangsters." And the district attorney always turns to this group and says, "No, it's not. We're doing everything that we can do. It's up to you people as citizens to see to it that gangsters are driven out of our city." Then came the church groups, and we tend to think of the Legion of Decency as being simply a Catholic body, which it did become. But the formation of the Legion of Decency in 1934 was really a combination of Protestant groups, spearheaded to be sure by the Catholic Church. The Protestant groups, Jewish groups came in on the formation of the Legion, with the idea that the movies had gone far enough, that it was time now to clean them up. And their way of cleaning was simply to haul out this production code, which Martin Quigley and Father Lord had designed, and which the film companies themselves had agreed to try to live by, and said, "This is the code, this is the way it's going to be, and if you don't follow the code to the letter, any film that the Legion condemns will be subject to boycott by all of the people, again primarily Catholic, who take the pledge to support the Legion and its findings." Now, there's nothing, and this is worth remembering, there's nothing that startles the motion picture companies more than the possibility of losing some customers. If customers stay away from their pictures, they stop making pictures, and they try to be selective about it. They try to find out what kind of pictures customers are staying away from and simply stop making that kind of picture rather than going out of business altogether. And so we found switches during the 30s. The madams of bordellos, it turned out now, were instead running rather respectable saloons. We found that the erstwhile heroes of the gangster movies, tough guys like Jimmy Cagney, were working for the FBI. There was a real sharp about face in the whole thing. But what is so stunning about it is that for more than 30 years, these same rules, these same restrictions on the medium were to remain in effect in this country. Certainly there were some attempts to fight the code, some attempts to change things. David Selznick, back in 1939, made a very strong case for not changing the famous last line of Gone with the Wind. He felt, and I think with quite good reason, that if Clark Gable were to stride out of Scarlett's life saying, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a darn. It might cause some titters." But damn was one of the words that was specifically barred by the code, and he had a very tough time getting permission to allow Clark Gable to exit with, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." War movies. Look at the war movies on television. They're not even allowed to say war is hell, because hell was another one of the banned words. And
There are more deer in the state of Wisconsin.
well, I was having dinner just the other evening with the writer-producer of one of those pictures, and he wanted to have just a modicum of GI language in his picture. Absolutely not. This was as late as 1948, when you still couldn't have a doughboy say damn or hell.
Nothing wrong with this at all. The big controversy on the bitter root.
I hesitate to say that we've come a long way, but that was ridiculous.
Gotta realize that
Probably the most notable breakthrough, and again, this seems terribly amusing today, but in 1953 it was a very courageous thing for Otto Preminger to do, to produce a film which included the word virgin, and again, a word that had been specifically spelled out as not being permitted by the production code. The heroine of that little comedy refers to herself at one point as a reluctant virgin, and Preminger took the chance. He said the play had run on Broadway. It was a fairly innocuous little comedy. It was cast with William Holden and David Niven, and a very significant thing had happened. The theaters, which had up until this time been owned by the motion picture companies, RKO had its own chain of theaters. The Loew's theater chain was tied in with MGM. Both of them had the same ownership. Paramount had its chain of theaters, and so on. In the year before, between 1950 and 1953, the Supreme Court had put out a consent decree which said that the movie companies could either produce and distribute, or produce and exhibit, or distribute and exhibit, but they could not do all three. They felt that this was a trust situation, and they broke it down into two. All of the companies, without exception, decided to go with the idea of producing and distributing and cutting loose their theater chains. This meant that the pledge that the companies had taken to support the production code and to respond to the Legion of Decency no longer applied to the theaters. They were cut loose from this pledge. And one of the first films that they cut loose with was The Moon is Blue, Mr. Preminger's film. And they found, to their surprise and to their satisfaction, that customers came in great numbers. And this emboldened Mr. Preminger and others to take similar, not vast risks, let's face it, but similar risks. In 1956, the same Preminger made Man with the Golden Arm, quite openly aware of the fact that this whole subject of dope addiction, was another one of the areas forbidden by the production code. And again, I don't have to tell you, the film was successful. While this was going on, this is the early 50s, we had another phenomenon in this country. A startling statistic, if I may. In 1946, in the entire country, there were only 12 theaters of the type we call now art houses, theaters that were showing the better European films, not as language films, not as a German theater or a French theater where German-speaking or French people went, but rather as a place where films of artistic merit, sometimes, were being exhibited as the regular policy. 12 theaters in 1946, 6 of them centered in New York. That spread it pretty thin through the rest of the country. Immediately after the war, however, this number began to change. And by the mid-50s, there were at least 500 houses which had a regular art house policy, and in some instances, where films showed extra stamina, like Wages of Fear, they were frequently booked into large chains. They got as high as 2,000 or 2,500 bookings. So Americans in considerable numbers began seeing the imports. They began seeing films like Open City and like Bicycle Thief, even though Bicycle Thief was almost barred by the customs office because there was a scene in which a little boy runs up a side street and pees against the wall of a building. There were, in other words, films that had a great deal more frankness than we were used to. We began to see films from France with a greater amount of sexual freedom. And the American public, that is to say, some sections of the American public that went to the art houses, was not shocked. As a matter of fact, what shocked everybody was the Brigitte Bardot phenomenon in the late 50s. I happen to know the lady who ran the Paris Theater, and she was not at all happy about booking into her really first-rate art house in New York, the film And God Created Woman. She told me at the outset of the booking of the engagement that she had done it in order to prove that art houses don't depend on sex in order to bring in their customers, and quite frankly expected the picture to last maybe 2 weeks. Quite frankly, the picture lasted for almost a year, and she was not altogether chagrined. But the thing that was so astonishing was that people who had never been to an art house, I'm going to get rid of this, people who had never been to an art house before began coming not necessarily to see art, they came to see Bridget, but and as much of Bridget as the law would allow. And within the year, within that year, all of the old catalog of Brigitte Bardot pictures, and God Created Woman was by no means her first. There's something like 17 pictures with Bardot, and all of them were showing in, again, quote, art houses all over New York and very soon all over the country. What it indicated, really, all of these things indicated, was that the country had moved away from the production code, had moved beyond those strictures, and was beginning to ask for something more than the American movie at that time was able to give them. I think the capper was Room at the Top, a very superior British film in which the young man, Lawrence Harvey, made his way to the top by seducing the daughter of the mill owner and by abandoning along the way his own French mistress, Simone Signoret. But this film